Okay, welcome to the meeting of the Governance and Audit Committee. So thank you for attending both online and in the Council chamber. Before we get into the formal agenda, you'll all be aware of the sad passing of Councillor Bob Greenland, who is a member of this committee, but also a long-standing and well-respected councillor for many, many years. At this time, I'd like to hand over to Councillor Phil Murphy to say a few words in memory of Bob and to lead a minute's silence. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I met Bob in 2004 when we both joined the council. He rose to the cabinet very quickly. I followed him shortly after. He had a very sharp intellect, was great company, hard-working, and very soon became deputy leader. He was resolute in dealing with the issues that occurred. He delivered the cattle market after a real battle. He delivered Morrison's and the public realm improvements all in Abergavenny. He almost single-handedly redesigned the leisure centre in Monmouth. He was a member, as several of us were, with the 21st Schools Board, delivering Caldecott, Monmouth, Raglan and Dewstow schools during that period and working on Abergavenny. He was a very effective chair of the Education Achievement Service, the EAS, for several years. And he saw through the last LDP and was working very much on the replacement one. I always remember the opposition always used to call him the Conservative Rottweiler because he really loved a political scrap in the chamber. He was also a very deeply religious man. In later life, he was ordained as a vicar, and his religious beliefs really carried him through all of the problems that he had with his illness. So his passing is a very great loss to the council, even in opposition. I'll miss him greatly, as I'm sure we all will.
Thank you, Phil, for those kind words. So in his honour, let's have a minute's silence starting from now, please. Thank you. Okay. We'll now start the formal agenda items, starting with apologies for absence. Notified of Colin Cross's apology. Any others, Wendy?
No, just Colin.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest to be notified and recorded, please? Not seeing any. Good, thank you. Let's move on to a public open forum element of the meeting. As you are aware, members of the public wishing to participate in this meeting are required to notify their intention in advance. I am not aware of any such notifications being received, and therefore we can proceed with the remaining items on the agenda. Let's do so by moving to item 4, which is the action list. So if we look at the first action is with Andy Wathen, Chief Internal Auditor, in respect to the annual governance statement. We'd like to give a brief update, please.
Thank you, Chair. Afternoon, members. This is the annual governance statement, which was in draft form when it came through to Governance and Audit Committee. I've now taken on board your comments and have presented it back into John to be included within the statement of accounts for 21-22. And my apologies that it's a late paper coming into your pack. I did take on board your comments, but I didn't manage to send it over to John in time for him to include in the report. So apologies for that one, Chair.
Okay, no problems. Thank you. Moving on to the second action. Second actions with you, Andy, and jointly with Peter Davis, Section 151 officer, and that's in respect of providing the committee with a list of key collaborations and who's responsible for the auditing of those. An update, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'll pick up this initially, and I'll just hand over to Richard Jones, who's just sat in front of me, because Richard's been doing some work with colleagues in order for us to satisfy this action. Maybe let me hand over to Richard first. I can come back then, because there's some further work to be done through this strategic leadership team in providing Richard and his team with the support needed. So, Richard, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. In line with the action, we revisited an existing list of key collaborations and the arrangements we have in, particularly the key governance arrangements we have in place for those, recognising that in the last few years there's been an evolution and change in some of the collaboration we have in place, and no doubt the arrangements for those have been updated accordingly. So we've just commenced a review where we're seeking input from directorate management teams on an updated list of their key collaborations and arrangements in place, and we've been putting together some of that as a desk-based exercise over the summer, and now working with Peter and colleagues in SLT, we're engaging with them to fill in any further gaps prior to them presenting that list back to you as Governance and Audit Committee. As you can imagine, it's quite an extensive list with the range of different services we deliver as a council, in collaboration with others and partnerships as well. So we'll get that completed to you as soon as possible.
And thanks. And if I could just come back in briefly, Chair, and probably useful for those watching from afar. Peter Davis, Deputy Chief Executive and Section 151 Officer of the Council. But just to sort of add to what Richard said there, clearly, and I think I'm sure the committee understands just in the nature that local authorities work in a collaborative sense. There are many such collaborative arrangements and of very different scales. I think through Richard and his team and the work that we'll do through directorate management teams and sort of overseen, I guess, and led by chief officers and strategic leadership team, we just need to sort of lock in to those that we see as being the significant ones, because those are the ones that we need to gain the levels of comfort and reassurance. Thus the action that sits there within the action list. So I think if we can go through that first hurdle, I guess, in order to get a clear line of sight on those significant collaborations, and then obviously to bring with that and alongside that and back into Governance and Audit Committee an overview in terms of the arrangements that are in place around those collaborations, which is, I'm sure, Chair, that you're not just after a list, you're also after an understanding just in terms of the nature of the arrangements in place.
Thank you. That's correct. I want this committee to have visibility over those key collaborations, partnerships, and similar type arrangements, understanding sort of how we then get assurance that those collaborations, partnerships, etc., are appropriate and being well controlled. I think that's a relevant, a legitimate matter for this committee. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Richard. We can move on to the third action, please. So yet again, this action is jointly with Peter Davis and Andy Waffen, and in respect of ensuring that our reports considered by the committee are clearly sort of cross-referred to our terms of reference or similar, so we can demonstrate that we are effectively meeting our terms of reference. I don't know who wants to take that, Andy? Can you take that, please?
Thanks, Chair. Just to let members know that work is in train to formalise the terms of reference of this committee and a date in the diary to work that through. So we'll be reporting back in due course, Chair. Okay,
thank you. Next action is a common theme emerging on the Treasury Outturn report. Yet again, that's with Peter Davis, the Deputy Chief Exec, and John Davis, in respect of picking up some points in relation to that Treasury Outturn report. I beg your pardon. Any update, please?
Thanks, Chair. I believe, just taking those in order, number one was provided off the back of the previous meeting as an email. Number 2, I think that's probably remiss of me. I haven't provided anything specifically to members of the committee. I know certain discussions have taken place since the meeting. I think what I would expect, Chair, is that the whatever path we go down in terms of accommodating any ethical investment, that will be accommodated within the Treasury strategy, which will be developed in the new calendar year, right at the start of the new calendar year. So I think it's probably best if we revisit that at the most appropriate committee that receives that draft Treasury strategy.
Okay, thank you. May I just check with members whether we can therefore close this action for this committee and look to Ian in particular for his guidance?
I think so, Chair, because it's going to come up anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in conversation with Peter Davis and with checking the wording with him, I'll be putting forward a motion to full council in September in relation to this, where it will get debated by full council.
Thank you. In that case, we'll close for action, please, Wendy. Okay, before the next action, it's labelled Action 9, Internal Audit Outturn Report. That's in respect of inviting service managers to the next meeting. Clearly, I've had conversations with Andy Woffin, Chief Internal Auditor. Those managers were not able to attend this meeting, but I'm hopeful they'll be able to attend at our next committee meeting. But Andy, if you could confirm that, please.
Thanks, Chair. The 2 service managers were invited. Unfortunately, as you say, they couldn't attend, and we're hopeful that they will attend next year. I'm just waiting for confirmation from the service managers and the head of service, but they've certainly been made aware of your next meeting in October.
Thank you. Moving on to action labelled number 11, draft self-assessment report. I think there's a query on one relatively minor element, and that's that of Richard Jones, performance manager. Richard, are you able to provide an update, please?
Just to say, Chair, we circulated, I think, a detailed breakdown via email from Wendy, so subject committee being satisfied, pending the views.
Yeah, I recall that email. I was satisfied. I think the point was raised by Colin Prosser. He's not here today, but let's assume he is satisfied. And on that basis, we will close that action. So thank you, Richard. And the final action is in respect to a forward work programme, and this is really sort of ensuring that we fully meet our terms of reference by setting out those papers, reports which this committee should receive to ensure that we can effectively demonstrate compliance with our terms of reference. This action is jointly with myself and Andy Woffin, Chief Internal Auditor. Andy, do you want to give a quick update, please, in terms of where we are with this?
Thanks, Chair. This is in train. We're due to formalise it, and we have a date in the diary, and we'll report back in due course. And then we will make sure that we reconcile all the reports coming to committee on the forward plan with the terms of reference.
Thank you. If there are no questions or comments, we'll move on to the next agenda item.
Chair, I'm putting my hand up on the online thing, but clearly you're not seeing that, so we need to just check our systems here. But okay, Tony's also got his hand up there, I think.
Apologies, I was assuming that it would send me notification that people were putting up their hands, so that's entirely my fault. Okay. Yeah, so I was, okay, doesn't matter. Okay, so Martin, okay, over to you in the first instance then, please.
I'm first and second on the list apparently, so that's quite something. I was going to check, just a general comment about this action list. I think it's a great innovation, and I think it's really helpful. However, it needed more detail on the actions that have been taking place. We've had helpful verbal updates today. It would be helpful to say, action was dealt with on such a date by email, recommend closed or carried forward. And just to pull Andy up on in due course, can we nail due course down to an actual committee meeting when that's going to come to us? Sorry, Andy.
So thank you, Martin. That's a fair point, and it's a point I've already made to officers, and they've taken that point on board. So the action list will be reformatted in future to give more precision in terms of when these actions will be expected to be completed by. Tony, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's item 0.9.2, provision of fraud figures. You've closed the item down, but we haven't got the provision of fraud figures on that one.
Chair, I think
that was to do with COVID payments, if I remember rightly. Am I right? Yeah.
Chair, that's down to me. I was going to incorporate that into the outturn report because that was what it related to. I have not got the figures for the COVID frauds that we've referred to, but I will get those to you by the next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I overlooked that. Okay, if we're happy to move on then. The next agenda item, item 5, is the statement of accounts.
Chair, before we move on, could we record our call to?
Thank you, Tony. That's a very good point, which I overlooked.
I don't know whether you knew or not, but it came on the news.
Mike's not on, so the people online won't hear that.
Okay, but I'll leave you to repeat what I said then, Chair.
Okay, so I understand from Councillor Tony Easton that Her Majesty is being taken ill and her family have been called to Balmoral. Tony quite rightly sort of wanted to pass on this committee's sort of thought to Her Majesty and confirm that we are thinking of her at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Right, item 5, statement of accounts. Right, this item's going to be introduced by John Davis, Assistant Head of Finance. We've been fortunate to have some of John's time earlier in the pre-meet where John talked us through the key elements of statement of accounts. So John, thank you for that. When you introduce the topic, please assume we have read the papers. It's you will understand that it's a long and technical paper. It would be really helpful if you could just confirm the purpose of this paper coming to the committee, but also maybe as well, if possible, highlight the key messages and thereafter sort of talk in some potential detail around the process by which the statement of accounts are being produced to give this committee confidence that the statement of accounts are reasonable and are in a good place to be spent subject to audit. So, John, without further ado, over to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. I shall try and incorporate all of that in the summary. What we have in front of us is the draft statement of accounts for 2021-22 for Monmouthshire County Council. These have been published on our website and they've been handed over to Audit Wales for the external audit process to commence, and that's underway. As the Chair highlighted, it is a large document. It's still over 100 pages long, despite our best efforts. It is highly regulated. It is a technical document, and it isn't always easy to interpret. To that end, we have provided an Appendix 2, which does look to go into detail on some of the key themes and variances and messages emerging from the accounts. Ultimately, I think the role of the Audit Committee is to approve the final statement of accounts that will hopefully be coming forward in November of this year, at the end of the external audit process, and that the committee themselves can take assurance that the process that we go through as an authority and through the external audit process has followed the regulations in place, and that the accounts provide accurate, useful and hopefully understandable information to the end reader of the statement of accounts. That will include seeking assurances that we've got sufficient resources and preparations are in place by the authority to facilitate the external audit process, and that is carried out in a timely manner. So this draft is provided to this committee as an opportunity to comment on the content and the messages contained within it. There is still an opportunity to amend or include additional information, and this can be facilitated during the audit process. So, the committee can provide real added value to this by giving an external perspective. Quite often it's easy to get lost in the detail of this big document. So the covering report goes into a little bit of detail around the regulations applying, the deadlines that were applicable this year, which I'll come on to, and the process that we followed in terms of those dates in the table that's provided. I think it's fair to say it was another extremely challenging year. Largely due to the pandemic again and the wider impact that it had on our workloads as both the finance team and the wider teams that have a huge responsibility to feed into the statement of accounts. We were provided significant additional funding again during the year that had to be accounted for. There were grant schemes that continued to be administered by the authority on behalf of Welsh Government. So all of that played into adding to workloads and adding to the complexity of some of those arrangements that we needed to close down. Also internally, as a finance function, we have a restructure ongoing, and this certainly impacted on our abilities to meet some of those deadlines. So we had to prioritise key pieces of work. We wanted to deliver on items of work that had significant and immediate financial implications for the authority. So budget outturn reports, reserve decisions, treasury management reports. So all of those needed to be finalised anyway before the wider statement of accounts was produced. But those were key reports that had immediate decisions and implications on the authority. We have got a good track record of meeting closure deadlines. But certainly since the onset of the COVID period, it's common for deadlines to be pushed back, and certainly counterparts, at least across Wales, have seen similar issues, and I'm aware of some authorities that are still yet to publish draft statement of accounts. Whilst that's not where we want to be as a finance function at the moment, we have to give consideration, I think, to the wider well-being of staff. And appreciate there's no quick fix at the moment here, given all the external factors that the committee will be well aware of. We have to be aware that it's going to take some time to recover and embed a more robust solution for us that we can deliver on those deadlines in the future. So whilst there has been a slight delay in producing these draft statements, which I know I provided a verbal update to the last committee, it has been important to allow time for a robust closure process to be carried out and to ensure that a proper quality review process was in place, such that the responsible financial officer can obtain that sufficient assurance that the authority has fulfilled its obligations in meeting those financial reporting requirements. I won't go into the detail around Appendix 2. As I said, that provides some key messages around the balances and transactions this year. Other than to say, as I outlined previously, that the pension, future pension liability for the authority, the movement in that due to actuarial assumptions often dwarfs the other movements in the accounts. So it's something that members need to be aware of, that the balance sheet moves significantly year on year, but a lot of that is down to that movement in assumptions around the future pension liability. Just to quickly update on the external audit process, it is progressing well. There are currently no indications of slippage in the agreed deadlines to complete the audit work itself. We have agreed a workable solution in terms of the issue that I've updated the committee on previously in terms of asset valuations. We've agreed a solution that doesn't look to call on significant amount of authority resources while still providing Audit Wales the necessary comfort that those valuations are up to date and robust. But the committee should be aware of an ongoing national issue surrounding the accounting of infrastructure assets. So that's our roads, our bridges, culverts, etc., where SIPFA and audit bodies themselves are still to reach conclusion on the derecognition of some of those assets when they are replaced. A decision has been mooted this month on that. But there is concern nationally that this may delay the sign-off of audits nationally. So, Chair, I think whilst I can answer questions on the specifics in the accounts, ultimately, I think as I've outlined, it's around the committee themselves taking assurance, as you've stated, that the process we've gone through as an authority is robust. And that we followed the regulations in place. And as I said, this will culminate in you receiving a final statement of accounts in November for approval. So I'm happy to take questions, but if you could highlight the area of the accounts that we're talking about when the questions are asked, please, that'd be really helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John. Really helpful. Okay, so over to members, and I see Phil has a question. Please, Phil.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And my question hovers around the balance sheet, so that's going to be easy to find. First of all, let me say that there's very, very thorough report. There's a real effort, from my previous role in the council. I know how much effort went into this, particularly as you were still mopping up after COVID. So, congratulations, I think, should come from this committee to the whole of the team who produced these accounts. Glad to see that the balance sheet's stronger. The council fund is stronger. We managed to put an extra 4 million into reserve, so we've got a general fund which is a lot stronger than it's been for a long time. Although, given the current pressures, I think that'll disappear pretty rapidly. And of course, we did have the benefit of, as you said in your introduction, of lots of grants coming through during that period. But you also mentioned the pension scheme, and the balance sheet is a lot stronger this time with the reduction in creditors and the improvements elsewhere. But last year got a real hit with the pension scheme. I know the triennial value exercise is being done. So are you anticipating any major effect on the current year's accounts as a result of that? It's probably too early to tell, but I think it's worth flagging up that the difference between the accounts this year and the previous year, it can considerably be swayed by movement on the pension scheme.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think it's, as I mentioned in the summary at the outset, this is something which is often a large change on the balance sheet, and it's a big figure. So, that future pension fund liability is decreased by 47.5 million, largely as a result of a decrease in the potential scheme liabilities going forward, and also a recovery, as you've said, in terms of that year-on-year impact of COVID and the situation that it was in the 12 months prior. This is a fund that's there for the long-term funding of pensions, and the annual variations can skew figures, but it's important to note that any such liability will never arise in one single year. So this is being addressed through higher employee and employer contributions to the fund. What the triennial valuation exercise has recently shown is that those projections that we have in for contributions as an employer within our medium-term financial plan are in line with the most recent triennial exercise. So I guess to answer the question directly, we're there or thereabouts in terms of our assumptions at the moment in terms of contributions to the fund.
Thanks for that. It's good to hear.
Okay, Ian, please.
Yeah, I mean, again, in relation to reserves, obviously big increase in the reserves that are allocated to the schools within the county, particularly the secondary schools. I mean, I think we're up to 6 million on that. I understand how that's arisen in terms of grants and issues there. I suppose I don't have a sense in terms of how that impacts on the future health of the council. How quickly do we expect those reserves to be drawn on by the schools, or how much of that is going to be over a period of years?
Thanks. So we are working closely with schools to ensure that effective and best use of those balances is made. What we haven't done is put hard deadlines on them in terms of using those amounts. I think we appreciate that probably heads of those schools are best placed to decide on what is effective investment, and we have to appreciate that some schools are probably further along a path of recovery in terms of COVID recovery, a return to improving standards and such like that funding's been earmarked for. So I think it would be unwise to put fixed deadlines and expectancies on schools to reduce those balances down to a certain level by X date. But we are working closely with schools to ensure that investment is effective, it's made in the right places, and really goes to improving those learning standards, or a recovery in those learning standards, which is what a lot of that funding was earmarked for by Welsh Government.
Can I just come back on that a bit more? So am I to take it then that those reserve balances are primarily intended to be used for recurrent expenditure rather than capital expenditure, is my first question. And then still, yeah, I could totally accept that there's no merit in us setting artificial deadlines, but in terms of expectation, do we expect that balances to be used within the course of the next 2 financial years, or are we looking at it being a much more longer term pool to draw upon?
So yeah, you're quite correct that this is earmarked for recurrent expenditure. We have a fairer funding agreement in place with schools that covers that capital side of house. That being said, some schools will look to invest where necessary in some capital improvements if it means improving that learning environment for pupils. But yes, I think there's an expectancy that those balances will look to reduce over the near term, 2 to 3 years. But accepting that some schools are behind others in terms of where they need to be in investing and along the road to recovering those standards.
Martin.
Thank you, Chair. A few observations and then a couple of questions, if I may. In the narrative section at the front, I'm on the top of page 7, where it refers to financial outlook in the medium term. It talks about current environment, global economies have been hit by the pandemic, Ukraine and Brexit. It feels like that was probably written a month or so ago, because I suspect it was, and the world has moved on, as it tends to do, where the cost of living crisis is the magic phrase that everybody uses nowadays, and what that means to the council. So some recognition of that being a major impact going forward, I think would be helpful. Further through the document, particularly in pages 49 and 50, I spotted them. There's a couple of abbreviations in there. I think D-cells is an old language for one of the Welsh Government departments, which probably isn't called that anymore. And just to check, and just abbreviations that for things that a reasonable reader is not going to spot. There's one on page 50, which is CCRCD. So that'd be helpful to understand. And just my final question is really about the accounts as a drafters were dated 8th of August, a month ago to the day. I just wonder if you can give us an update, Jonathan, or perhaps it's for Audit Wales, to talk us through the process in terms of audit thus far and any issues that have emerged through the audit.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think those are fair points in terms of those couple of issues you picked up. Yes, it was written probably 5 to 6 weeks ago now in terms of that, and you know, it is a fluid situation. Absolutely. So we can take that on board and perhaps look to ensure that the final version that comes to committee in November is I guess up to date and takes on board any significant issues that have come forward since then. And take your point about some of the abbreviations. I think in our attempt to keep these accounts under a certain amount of pages, we sometimes do abbreviate. In terms of the external audit process, I met with Audit Wales colleagues this week, and as I said in the summary at the outset, the audit is progressing well. There are no major issues raised to date. I know Audit Wales themselves have some slight resourcing issues, which I'm sure Rachel may want to come in on, Chair. But as I said, I don't think there's any indication at the present time that there's any significant slippage and risk in meeting that deadline in terms of completing their audit work. So maybe I'll leave it to Rachel to come in on that side, though, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, would you like to say a few words at this point, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So John's quite right. The audit is progressing quite nicely. It's obviously early days. Receiving the account in August. There's understandably some annual leave on both Monmouthshire and our side. So we're starting to see the audit work pick up now during September. But yeah, no significant issues arising thus far. And John quite rightly mentioned we have got some resourcing issues internally. I suppose the slippage is clashing with some of our graduate trainees going to college, and we've had some sickness. But I am working with colleagues within Audit Wales to sort of gather to obtain some additional resource from other audits that are sort of more progressed. So yeah, no significant concerns on that front for meeting the November Audit Committee.
Thank you, Rachel. So back to the questions. Peter Strong, please.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, can I echo what Councillor Murphy had to say about the value of these accounts, this time very much from a lay perspective. Although it is a technical document, it contains, or they contain a great deal of information that would be of use to anybody who wants to understand the workings of the County Council. So my thanks, or our thanks to the team for the preparation of them. If I could make an observation about school reserves, clearly schools need reserves. A school can soon run into quite severe difficulties through problems like unexpected levels of staff absence, particularly long-term absence, sudden issues with building maintenance and so on. I think what would be useful is some sort of indication of what level of reserves it might be considered to be appropriate for a school to carry in a normal year, given that we are far from a normal year still. A couple of other points I want to make that are different. I don't know if anyone wants to come back on that first, and then I can come back on different points.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so just specifically in terms of the schools reserves, the Welsh Government guidelines in respect of that guide a minimum balance of around 50,000 for a primary school and 100,000 for a secondary school. That is a guided balance over the course of time. So that would be the levels that we would look for the schools to work towards.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very useful. A couple of points on the content of the accounts. Page 40, well, it's 39 to 40, deals with transfers into the earmarked reserves, and I'm particularly interested in the three county investments: Oak Grove, Castlegate, and the Newport Retail Park, which, well, particularly the second and third ones there, still exercise the minds of quite a number of residents. So we do get asked questions about them. Can I take it that the figure in the right-hand column actually does represent net income over a number of years, that there are no costs to be set against that, such as repayment of loans and so on, or is that not the case? So I've got one other point to raise, so perhaps we can deal with that one and I'll come back to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So these reserves were intended as effectively sinking funds to meet, unexpected pressures over the term of the arrangements. So in terms of Newport Leisure Park voids in tenancies over a period of time, and similarly with the solar farm, some of the kind of ad hoc maintenance that may be required on some of the hardware on site. So they're very much held for those purposes, and those balances represent what is available at the end of March 22.
Right, okay, thanks for that. And then thirdly, or finally, if I can find the page, just excuse me for a moment, the reference to the value of heritage property assets, I think it's page 55, the valuation, I agree, I understand it'd be very difficult to put a value on some of these. How on earth you put a value on the Battalion War Memorial in Frogmore Street, Abergavenny, I don't know. But given that the assets include Caldecott Castle and the old station at Tintern, it seems the value you've put on those is 149,000, which seems to be remarkably low. I just wonder, is that sort of predicated on the assumption that it can never be sold, or even if it was sold, any possibility of getting change of use would be out of the window? Is that the assumption there?
Yeah, I think you're pretty much along the right lines. It represents an existing use value, so in so much that, effectively the cost to the authority of maintaining those assets is significant, and therefore the value in its existing use is comparatively low to the authority. Just one point to note on that is that the museum exhibits and Nelson collection have been subject to a recent revaluation. That took place in August of this year, and the results of that will feed into the values being published in the next financial year statement of accounts.
Right, thank you, that's helpful.
Tony.
Thank you, Chair. And just on the point about the heritage assets, I believe that some of them are uninsurable. So you've got to build that into your base as well. I come to the question about the grant that we've had for the 20 mile an hour trial across Monmouthshire, £400,000. Has anything been built in there for reversal of parts of it if it's necessary, or have we spent all the £400,000 on setting the scheme up?
Sorry, can I just confirm where that is contained?
Page 55, we've had just under £500,000 from the Welsh Government for a 20 mile an hour scheme. Has all that money been spent, or has money been kept back to reverse some of the changes which have been part of the trial?
I can't immediately find the reference to it, but yes, that was received for the trial of that. I'm not sure whether that's been fully spent. Would have to go back to colleagues to find out, unfortunately. So maybe if I can come back to the committee to confirm.
Councillor Easton, just to make a point, and I guess John can just sort of confirm this just in terms of the basics of the accounting. So certainly if we get to the end of the year, say for example, we've had a grant award of £500,000, and we've actually committed and spent, or we haven't committed and spent all of that. From a practical perspective, there'd be discussions with Welsh Government in terms of whether that funding can be retained and rolled forward and drawn upon in the following financial year, or whether it needs to be returned back to Welsh Government. So I guess specific to your point in terms of the 20-mile-an-hour zone, obviously John can follow that one through and just clearly understand as to what the situation is.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Okay, so thank you, John. Maybe if I start by saying, so thank you from the committee, thank you to you and the team for putting these statement of accounts together. I know from my own experience this is a significant amount of hard work, so thank you for doing a very diligent job. When you introduced the paper, you talked about the process and gave us some real insights in terms of the process followed, the controls, which gave this committee some confidence over the robustness of the numbers. But you did allude to a couple of points around the fact that this was quite resource intensive, and it'd be quite helpful if you could say a few more words about capabilities and capacities within the finance team, because I understand you are carrying 1 or 2 vacancies. I may be wrong there, but I'd like you to just advise the committee of that. And then just follow on from that and expand slightly by talking about the level of key person dependency, succession planning, and any sort of risks and controls this committee should be aware of, please.
Thanks, Chair. I think, again, it's, obviously quite a fluid situation in terms of dealing with some of these issues. But, you're quite right to say that we are carrying a couple of significant vacancies within the finance function at the moment. I think when I alluded to it in the summary, I mentioned, a focus on staff well-being, and that has been a key theme for us during the closure period this year. We haven't wanted to burden staff and burn staff out such that they're broken. We need to have an eye on their well-being over the long term. I think as a finance function, we're probably facing similar issues to the wider sector in terms of recruitment. We currently have some advertisements at the moment in terms of posts, and certainly across Wales, local authorities are struggling to attract suitable talent into local authorities. That being said, we have an experienced team. We have a good knowledge base, and that allows us to the flexibility to call on staff and wider staff as needed through the process. In terms of succession planning, that is really now at the core of what we're trying to address during the current period. So we are looking to firstly recruit into those vacancies, but also look at that resourcing in terms of what do we need to return to a sustainable and effective finance function. That will rely on the senior finance posts also being recruited into and finalised, and that'll be a key part of the process, which we are looking to finalise now over the next few months. I don't know if Peter, if you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chair, and thanks to John, as articulate as ever. possibly a little bit diplomatic, I guess, towards the back end, given his acting position at the moment, and obviously certainly the senior end of the restructure that needs to see itself through and has been outstanding for quite some time. And clearly, I think the committee understands some of the challenges that we've had over the last couple of years, where the right opportunity has not presented itself, and we've had to take, I guess, a conscious decision on where our priorities needed to lie. And I think you'll understand that, particularly a case when you're bringing new blood in, or you've got the potential for that, it comes with its own draw on internal resource. So we've had to be very careful in terms of taking the moment to do that. But John is absolutely right. I think John referred to months in terms of the senior situation resolved. I think I'd probably turn that into weeks. So, I think it's very much imminent. And I think if I was going to list 3 priorities that sat within the finance sphere at the minute, no disrespect to Rachel if she's still on the call from Audit Wales. The audit is important. The closure, successful conclusion of the audit is important. But certainly my immediate 3 priorities are in terms of dealing with the current in-year recovery situation. A month 4 report will be coming through shortly. Acting on, but in any event, things that we had in train in terms of the further development of the medium-term financial plan. I think you'll all understand we are in and are entering an incredibly and possibly unprecedented set of challenges. And thirdly, and alongside that, and why I say weeks and not months, we need to get those points around capacity and resource locked in, because we're in for a bit of a rough ride, and we need to be able to draw on that expertise and capacity in order to make sure that the business is suitably and well supported through these times. If I could, Chair, just in case I don't get a further opportunity before we move forward, can I just echo the thanks and thank you, Chair, for and equally Councillor Murphy for making the comments and passing the thanks on to John and the team. Continues to be a bit of an extraordinary effort during very, very challenging times. So just whilst I got the floor and publicly, I'd just like to echo my own thanks, sincere thanks to John. And the wider teams for all of their efforts in bringing these accounts together. Thank you, Chair.
So thank you, Peter. Thank you, John. Very reassuring to hear much of that. So clearly you will need to prioritise, continue to prioritise quite rigorously over, of course, the next several weeks and months. From my perspective, I very much support that, and if there's anything we as a committee can do in terms of endorsing our prioritisation calls, please come back to us. It's absolutely essential you focus on the critical activities only, given the situation you very sort of eloquently outlined. In terms of 1 or 2 other matters, I'll jump to a very immaterial matter to begin with, then just wrap up this agenda item. If I look at table 16.8, John, that is with respect of remuneration. And it's just a simple question, John. I didn't understand the final column, so please, could you help me understand what that final column is telling me, please?
Just bear with me a second.
Yeah, it's a struggle to get to it. You're
So I'm looking at page 86 of the accounts themselves. So this is in respect of the banding of officer remuneration. So the left-hand column of the 21-22 section shows the total number of employees within that band of pay, and the right-hand column shows the number within that are teaching staff. So, for instance, let's say the 85,000 to 89,999 band, there are 4 employees within the council as a whole, within that band, one of which works in a school.
Thank you. It could be that simple. So if we look at the top row then, are we saying there's a member teaching staff who earns in the range of 130,000 to 134,999 pounds?
We are. That is a head teacher that is an executive head. So they have a position covering the head teacher role at Abergavenny and also within a school at Torvine. So unfortunately, I guess the table is a bit misleading in so much that we would recoup a percentage of that from Torvine for their role that they undertake within the Torvine school. But we are showing this gross as per the regulations require us to.
Thank you. So, very clear explanation. I just couldn't reconcile that entry with the preceding table, which shows the officer remuneration. But it doesn't matter. Clearly, you've given a very good explanation, so I'm content with that. And maybe my final question then, just to confirm, if we look at page 94, I think it's page 94, where there's a section on events after the balance sheet date, could you confirm there'll be no material events after the balance sheet date, please?
Thanks, Chair. Yes, as we stand of today's date, nothing has emerged since we've produced the draft statement of accounts that requires any notification, Chair.
Thank you. There are no further questions from members, so if I may summarise, yet again, thank you, John, thank you, team. This committee notes the draft statement of accounts and looks forward to receiving the audited copy in due course. If we now move on to item 6. Item 6 is the Audit Wales work programme and timetable. This will be introduced by Rachel Freitag from Audit Wales. So, Rachel, please, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So, very brief update from me. I suppose it's a very factual paper from us. It's simply sort of following up on our annual plan, which sort of sets out the work that we intended to do during the year. So this paper is just an update, albeit slightly outdated by now, given there was no meeting in August for us to bring it to. As of sort of setting out where we were with our work programme as at the 30th of June. It runs through our financial audit work and our performance audit work, and sort of sets out some of the recent publications, be it sort of directly relating to Monmouthshire or sort of the local government sector as a whole. I'm happy to take questions on it, but I wasn't going to sort of dwell on it as it is just factual and for you to note.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Are there any questions? I can't see any. Martin, please.
Yeah, I'm a little confused by the paper. As Rachel says, it's dated June 22, which is 2+ months ago now. We actually had a meeting in early July, so I don't know why this is sent here, and we didn't receive this on the 14th of July when we actually met last. And I actually, Rachel, rather than I wasn't attending to it, I was expecting you to give us an all update on almost everything, because everything is so out of date.
Right. Okay. Apologies. That's fine. The paper just wasn't ready in time for the paper deadline for the July meeting, unfortunately. As I indicated earlier, we are at some resourcing pressures internally, so apologies for that. And I believe we are on track for the 30th of September update. Apologies, my colleague Colin was due to run through this report, and he's had something come up last minute, so I will try and take you through each item.
No, Rachel, apologies. I did forget Colin wasn't here. May I suggest, with the committee's approval, we defer this item till Colin returns. That may be more convenient for you. Yeah, happy with that, Rachel?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. I could certainly provide an update, or we've already, I suppose, provided an update on the financial audit work, but I guess the performance audit progress would be better placed with Colin, if that is okay with everyone.
So Richard Jones, performance manager, is going to come in here.
Just to add on the performance audit side, in particular, the work plan there, obviously in terms of the springing forward report reference, that's next up on your agenda, or the next but one item on your agenda. And in terms of how the council is responding to completed audit work by Audit Wales, we do produce for you a 6-monthly monitoring report, which includes the council's response to Audit Wales's reports, both published locally directly to us as a council, but also some of those national reports there where they're particularly relevant to the local government sector. So that'll be coming forward to you at the next meeting as well. So just I'll give you some further information, not just about the reports that are on the work programme Rachel's presenting today, but also how the council is responding to the issues raised in them as well.
Thank you, Richard. Peter Davis would like to say a few words.
It's only a brief input, Chair, just to your suggestion back to Rachel, really, just to, I guess, defer. Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a quarterly submission that Audit Wales prepares for all local authorities. And I guess just that point that Martin touched on there, just in terms of timing, but I guess the next quarter end, we just need to probably look as to whether we can time that into a governance audit committee meeting that allows that to be received on in its timely form, and then I guess with Colin present, then we can have a purposeful discussion.
Thank you, Peter. Rachel, so what I think we're suggesting is we now defer this item until Colin's return, and then just to check in for Colin whether he wants to provide any verbal updates on the matters raised.
Yeah, that's fine. My understanding is that Colin was due to dial into the meeting at about 3 o'clock, so we may well see him shortly. But we probably run a bit quicker than we anticipated. So, yeah, I don't see a problem with it, but yeah, we'll wait for him to confirm.
Thank you, Rachel. In which case, we will move on to the next agenda item. And the next agenda item being the Internal Audit Progress Report. If you bear with me one moment until I'm trying to get there. Okay, so Internal Audit Progress Report. This paper will be introduced by Andy Woffin, Chief Internal Auditor. Andy, as per usual, assume we have read the paper, but please draw out key matters for the committee's attention.
Thank you, Chair. This is one of the regular reports that I'll be bringing to committee's attention. As I'm accountable to you as the Governance and Audit Committee, it will be reported in Quarter 1, Quarter 2, Quarter 3, and accumulating in an annual report for including Quarter 4. So it's twofold in terms of the adequacy of the internal control environment operated within the Council and the performance of the team. So from an expectation point of view, I would like members of this committee to consider the adequacy of the internal control environment based on my opinions, which I've issued to date, and the performance of the team. So if we just move through the report, Chair, we have started working obviously in terms of the agreed plan, but a lot of the site visits weren't undertaken in Quarter 1 because restrictions were still in place as a result of COVID. Pleased to say and to provide assurance to members that those restrictions have now eased, and we have gone out and we are currently doing site visits in Quarter 2. So that work will pick up in Quarter 2 and be reflected in the report I prepare for Quarter 2 and the performance thereon, and the assurance in terms of the number of opinions which we will then issue. So, as I said, this report is based on Quarter 1, and we are compliant with the public sector internal audit standards as part of our work which we undertake, and we provide an opinion on the adequacy of the internal control environment and what expected controls should be in place across the board. So for Quarter 1, we've completed 6 audit jobs to draft report stage, 2 of which were opinion related, and they're shown in a bit more detail in the appendix, but they are positive assurances in that the first one is the PTU maintenance follow-up, which was a substantial assurance, and the food procurement follow-up, which was considerable assurance. In terms of performance of the team, before we move on to the performance of the team, in quarter one as well, we tend to finalise any work that's at draft report stage as at the 31st of March. So we did have 8 reviews which were at draft report stage. Those opinions have been incorporated within the annual report issued to you previously. But at the end of quarter one, 7 of those 8 reviews had been finalised, 1 was still outstanding, and we are currently working on that, working with service managers to finalise that as we speak. There's been minimal work undertaken on special investigations as a result of us not identifying any fraud or any fraud being reported into the internal audit team. The main performance indicator for the team is the completion of the audit plan. We've completed 11% as at the quarter one end, in comparison with a target of 10%. And I'll quickly go through some of the other performance indicators when we come to the appendix. In terms of the staffing of the team, similar situation to John in the accountancy section. We have vacancies at the moment. We did have a team member seconded out to the team to support COVID pre-22-23. That person has got a promotion within the organisation, and we've subsequently filled that post. So the auditor post is now filled. We're currently running with 2 vacancies, a senior auditor and a audit manager. Those posts are currently out to advert, closing date 16th of September. So in terms of the detailed information, Chair, that's outlined on Appendix 1. It's in table format. It shows the number of substantials, the number of considerables that we've issued to date, and the reports which I've just referred to. We also identify any non-opinion work which we've concluded on during the year, and that's generally given financial audit advice to service areas. Appendix 2 outlines the definition of what audit opinions we use, and I have taken on board the previous members' comments about reflecting on those opinions, and we'll be reviewing those during the course of 22-23, reporting back to Audit Committee, Governance and Audit Committee, with a view to, if we do change them, they'll be implemented from the 1st of April moving forward 2023. I don't see much point in or relevance in changing them partway through the year, but I have noted the point made by a previous member. Sorry, point made previously by a member of this committee. Appendix 3 shows a quarter-on-quarter comparison of our performance indicators in a bit more detail. We're in relation to quarter one. The second box on that appendix is the current financial year's performance. As mentioned, the completion of the audit plan is 11%. Getting draft reports out on a timely basis is key. That's not as prompt as I'd like it to be. Draft reports we're getting out within 14 days of receiving comments from the managers, and the turnaround of final reports is 30 days. That's primarily due to the senior auditor and audit manager not being in post. In terms of recommendations that have been accepted by the service managers, that's around 90%. Percentage of clients at least satisfied with the audit process, I put that as non-applicable because we haven't finalised any audits of the audits which we finalised in 22-23, we haven't had any client satisfaction audits returned from those services managers yet, but I'll update committee as we progress through the year on that one. Percentage of directly chargeable time against planned, 68% against a target of 60, so that's a slight improvement. And number of special investigations that we've been involved with are 0 in quarter one. So at that stage, Chair, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Andy. I don't see any hands raised, but can I just check? Martin, please.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thanks for that helpful comment at the end, which I was going to raise if you didn't, so that's really, really good. Again, this is the end of June, and I don't know if you were in a position to talk about anything that's happened since, or anything you want to bring to the committee's attention in terms of any limited assurance reports that have happened between then and now. And just a flag, just as the last item was also an end of June issue. Timing is such that our next committee is the 14th of October. I'm worried about getting papers at a suitable time for us to read, that both Rachel's paper and your paper are going to miss that deadline again, and they'll be out of date by the time they come to the committee. How are we going to square this circle in terms of timing of, we either don't have meetings, papers that sit exactly at quarter end, or we move our meetings, I suspect.
I think that's a fair point. Unfortunately, the meetings are set in the diary. We will do our best to report back on a timely basis. It is quarterly, and unfortunately the quarter end doesn't quite tie in with when the papers are required for the meeting. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to continually report in to Audit Committee, to Governance and Audit Committee. I've got a responsibility for reporting on a quarterly basis. There will be other reports coming as well, in addition to that, to give you some assurance. There'll be 6-month reports on unfavourable audit opinions. There'll be reports on implementation successfully of audit recommendations. So we'll be continually reporting, and hopefully members will get some understanding of the level of assurance that I can bring. It would be unfair of me to report any unfavourable opinions at this stage if I haven't discussed them already with the service managers. So we have a process in terms of doing the audit work, going through quite a robust review process, then issuing a draft report out to the service manager. We then discuss that with the service manager. Once we've discussed it with the service manager, then I'm in a position to report to Governance and Audit Committee. So I will reflect on your comments, but I can't promise that we will do them on a exact timing basis, but we'll report as soon as we can into Governance and Audit Committee.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's really helpful. I wasn't for a second suggesting you bring draft opinions to us, because as we all know that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the final position. I just wonder if there's any work that had been finalised since between June and now that was of concern that you want to share with us, but I'm guessing that's not the case, so that's really good. The other issue is an issue, and we are sort of straitjacketed rather between dates of meetings and dates of reporting, and we'll just have to find a way through that, and perhaps we can advise the Democratic Services people to schedule meetings in a better way next year, I guess. But thanks for that, Andy.
Thank you. I have a couple of points, but just checking with members whether they wish to raise any points at this time. I'm not seeing any hands raised or anyone signalling me. Okay, Andy, let's talk about resourcing then. I think there are 2 elements. In a previous meeting, you indicated that you thought the 2 vacancies would be filled in September, so an update on that situation would be really helpful. And then if you look at paragraph 3.2, you appear to have member staff out of secondment. So given the resourcing situation, I am slightly surprised that that secondment is still in play. So if you could just pick up those 2 points, please.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of current vacancies, we're not going to fill the posts by September. They are currently out to advert at the moment. As mentioned, closing date a week Friday. So the likelihood is that those posts will be filled by December. As a result of that, I will need to talk with Peter to see if we can get any additional resources in from any external providers. In terms of the secondment, that does relate to the previous year. That is a comment that was supposed to reflect the work that we did on COVID, in terms of the business grants and the kind of fraud work that we were doing. That should not have been a separate sentence. It should have flowed from the same paragraph. It does relate to the previous year. That secondment post has now been replaced here. So from 1st of April, we no longer have a seconded person out of the team, but that post as an auditor has been filled.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so I understand the situation in terms of being unable to fill those vacancies in September, as previously indicated. It is slightly disappointing. I am concerned about potential impact on the audit plan, and I would encourage those discussions with Peter Davis, Deputy Chief Executive. And for what it's worth, I think this committee would very much support and endorse any proposal in respect of buying in contract resource to fill that vacancy, because I think it's critical, given the sort of situation in terms of pandemic, the challenges facing this company in respect of its risk control and governance arrangements, that the audit plan is delivered in full this year. So yet again, I would encourage you to have a conversation and to deliver that plan as previously sort of committed to. I'll pause there. Any further comments or reflections from members? Okay, thank you, Andy. Right, I think Colin Davis has rejoined us, so welcome back, Colin. And if I may, could we circle back to agenda item 6, which is the Audit Wales Work Programme timetable? We've noted that it is slightly dated because it covers the month end of June, but are there any particular points you wish to draw to our attention, Colin?
I mean, I think we're discharging our duty to the wider council, its officers and members, that having given you an audit plan, we're delivering against that plan. And you can see for the individual elements, albeit a little bit out of date, but as at the end of June, where we were in relation to each of those. None of those particular audit items present me with any concern about where we currently are against them. So unless you have any questions about any individual things, I've got nothing more to raise on that.
Okay,
information.
Of course, so thank you, Colin. Just let me check with members. Any questions or comments? Martin, please.
Can I, recognising it is the end of June and therefore more than 2 months out of date, there are some things in here that I'm particularly interested in. We're springing forward, we've got on the agenda, and that's the next item. But just above that, at the bottom of page 3, there's an assurance and risk assessment, which this committee will be very interested in. It says summary report to be issued August 22. Has that been issued?
I believe we've issued it. If we haven't issued it yet, it's certainly crossed my desk, so I know that it's in the course of drafting. Yes, I mean, I think that report will be of interest to this committee, and once it's been cleared and agreed with officers, I'm sure it will come to you in due course.
I think Richard Jones will come in here. Richard, please.
Yes, thanks, Jay, and thanks, Colin. It is in draft at the moment, and it will be, as Colin rightly said, will be then put on the forward work planner for the next appropriate Governance and Audit Committee to review, which will either be October, pending the finalisation.
Okay, so that one has slipped in. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I suggest we move on. We move on to item 8. Item 8 is the Audit Wales Spring Forward report. This will be sort of jointly introduced by Colin Davis from Audit Wales, and then in respect of the Council's management response by Richard Jones, Performance Manager. So if I hand over to Colin in the first instance to talk us through, maybe quite briefly, the Audit Wales report. Colin.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll just try and share my screen. Sorry, Chair, it's taking a few minutes. There we are. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, rest assured, this is very brief. Firstly, in terms of context of our report, the underlying principle of this is that this work is that the COVID-19 pandemic impacted on demand for buildings and the way that staff work. And this report examines some of those impacts and evaluates the arrangements the Council has in place and is putting in place to adapt and maintain the delivery of its services, working with the knowledge and the learning from its experiences of the pandemic. We undertook the review between November 21 and May 22. And this isn't a report specific to Monmouthshire County Council. It's been undertaken in each of the 22 councils. I'm sure members have looked at the report, but if I just point to paragraphs 9 and 10, where our findings and conclusions are summarised, you should get the full picture of the report from there. And what I like to call the so what question is answered in our recommendations in Exhibit 2. As in all cases, this report and its recommendations have been agreed with council officers. And all of those 22 reports will be published on the Audit Wales website in due course. And this report for Monmouthshire, I can confirm, is on the website. So the key findings and conclusions, firstly, in relation to buildings, stroke assets. So what did we find? We found that the council has a good understanding of its assets and is actively considering what the future workplace will look like. And it's got an eye to developments in both the public and the private sectors to inform that consideration. Agile working is something that's already been put in place by the council, and that will continue for non-customer facing staff. But it became clear to us that no further decisions around its building assets were planned or in train. And that was because there needed to be more certainty about its future building needs for such decisions to be formed. In that context, a new asset management strategy is needed and is being developed. The previous asset management strategy and the previous people management strategy both came to an end in 2022. That's quite common. It's a new administration in the authority. You're shaping a new corporate plan, and of course those key strategies, asset management and workforce strategy, will be key enablers of the new corporate priorities. So the timing is appropriate. Notwithstanding that, decarbonisation is clearly a key driver for change, and particularly so in Monmouthshire. And those decisions, when they come on the future use of or rationalisation of its assets, will clearly be made in the context of corporate priorities, place-making plans and town centre regeneration, as they should be. As the council begins to articulate this future vision, through both the strategy and its work to understand its future asset needs, it must place the sustainable development principle at the heart of those considerations. I'll come back to that before I finish my summary. And the final finding I wanted to highlight on buildings with asset management, performance reporting and scrutiny arrangements are currently underdeveloped. And as that new strategy is being developed, measures will be a key element of that, and reporting on performance and scrutiny arrangements will need to be considered. Moving on to workforce, as I've already said, agile working will continue for non-frontline service staff. Again, a new people strategy is needed and is being developed. And it's clear that that's being informed from a strong evidence base and also active consideration of emerging trends, again, trends across the public and the private sector. What also came out to us, the way the council was starting to use available data in this area demonstrated really effective and integrated thinking, particularly around digital workforce, assets and decarbonisation. Real focus on using things like Power BI to bring together data and use it to evaluate and draw out directions of travel. As in all councils that we've carried out this review in Wales, skill shortages are an identified risk, and I know that won't be a surprise to anybody in the room. Many of the roles the council is struggling to recruit to are the result of national shortages or even regional shortages, and examples of that are in technical posts, engineers and such, and roles in social services in particular. And again, in bold, in developing its new people workforce strategy, the council must place the sustainable development principle at the heart of those considerations. In terms of performance in this area, workforce data and trends are reviewed internally, and senior officers are well informed of workforce issues. But the pandemic has impacted on elected member scrutiny of the people strategy, so that needs to be revisited and reinstated. That concludes my summary, but before I invite questions, the highlighted text. It would not be appropriate for me to say that the previous iterations of the people and the asset strategies have not considered the Sustainable Development Principle. They have. But I think the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act was passed in 2015. And we've reached the stage now where not just ourselves, Audit Wales as regulators, but also the Commissioner and staff, the bar is being raised. The expectations are more than a reference to the various 5 ways of working in strategic documents will suffice, will comply. That's why I put that in bold. It's not. I think in the report it says should. In this presentation, I changed should to must. It's a statutory requirement, and the expectations are that they will be. The council, in its response to us, has recognised that, but I wanted to give some emphasis to that. It's probably our key overall recommendation. Thank you, and I invite questions.
Thank you, Colin. Questions for Colin, please. Martin.
I guess the obvious question, Colin, is you said you've done a similar piece of work across all 22 local authorities. I know we don't believe in league tables, but if you could give us some idea as to how well advanced our thinking is in this area, and if there are actually any examples of really good practice in other authorities that we could learn from.
Well, this has been quite a high-level review. So, I mean, I think the ability to draw, detailed comparisons is not difficult. But I've tried to give you a clue in this summary. Not every council's summary would start with the council has a good understanding of its assets. There may quite rightly in this case be a reluctance to take big future decisions regarding asset rationalisation because there's a hell of a lot of uncertainty out there and things need to sharpen and focus before those decisions would be properly informed. But when the time comes, you've got a really good understanding of the assets that you have and you're not sitting on your laurels waiting for the time to be right. You're doing a lot of preparatory work for that. That isn't the case in all councils. Likewise, I think I pointed to some really innovative and great examples of using data around the understanding workforce. Again, there's been a dearth of data in reports. I'm sure some reports that have come before you as a committee will contain things like evaluative statements, but you might be looking, well, where's the evidence of this? Where's the measure that I can look at? Where's the performance of that? And I can see that the council's taking strides to get appropriate data there together and to learn from that and be informed from that. So those are 2 examples where I think, Monmouthshire County Council compares, as well as any other council that we've reviewed in those regards and better than some. So I hope that helps.
That's really helpful, Colin. Actually, a very helpful report. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments, Ian?
Yeah, thanks for this. I want to focus a bit on the workforce aspect of this for a moment. I've got a couple of questions and comments. On Exhibit 1, you give some key facts and figures, and you talk about, so for example, the percentage of staff who are male and female. It's not particularly helpful just at that headline. I'm assuming that you've probably got a more detailed breakdown in terms of pay grade or levels of seniority, because it is to be expected in a local authority that the majority of staff will be women because of the nature of some of the lower paid, lower skilled workers. It would be more interesting to see how that fits across different grades. Similarly, within that same thing, not just looking at gender, but also looking at issues around disability, I think would also be quite interesting for us in terms of people's strategy. And So that's one question on that. And you also talk about the percentage of staff who left the council, 14%. Again, I'm not quite sure how that compares in terms of what's the level of churn of staff in terms of average longevity of staff holding, again, at different grades. And there's no reference to vacancy rates. We've talked about this, within the finance function, but clearly there's vacancy rates right across the council. So I'd like to maybe see if there's a bit more of an in-depth analysis on that. So those are sort of areas of key facts and figures analysis I think would be helpful. Moving ahead...
Can you just pause there and just let me respond to that element of it? Because I think everything you've said, I agree with you entirely. And as a committee member, if I was one in the council, I'd be looking to officers to provide me with that level of information. If I was undertaking a review of the workforce planning arrangement, this wasn't such a review. The focus of this review was a high-level review to see how the council was learning the lessons of the pandemic and planning appropriately for future adaptations, if not transformation of its service delivery. So those numbers were picked, I suppose, to justify, well, if you're going to have a review that does that, why focus on assets and workforce? Well, just those numbers just say how important the numbers and valuation of buildings and built structures and, of course, the most important asset of all your workforce are in terms of their relative size, cost, etc. So it really just supports the fact that why did Audit Wales pick assets and workforce for this initial review? Of course, there's more data around, and as we say, you're using that data very effectively in Monmouthshire Council. Now I've said that, you'll know that you'll be able to go to those officers and ask them for the information that you've just described. And if it's not readily available, then you'll have to come back to me and say we got it wrong.
Thanks, because that actually very closely leads into what my next point or question was going to be, which is not necessarily aimed at you, but was aimed at the council in terms of you reference the people strategy and you reference the ability for elected members to be able to scrutinise the people strategy. I just wasn't quite sure within the council where that scrutiny sits. Does it sit within this committee? Does it sit within the Performance and Overview Committee? Because I'm on both of those committees and I've not seen anything in relation to people strategy. So
may I try to answer that question, Ian? I think it's a fair question. It's a question I've posed as well to officers, and I'd be very keen that this committee sees the developing people strategy as well as asset strategy, because it's got a role to play in terms of how that strategy is developed, how it's governed, and how the performance against it is tracked. So for me, it's a legitimate area of interest for this committee, and I'll be discussing it with officers over the course of the next few weeks. Are there any other questions or comments on the Audit Wales report before we move on to Richard's voiceover? I'm not seeing any. Before Richard speaks, can I just point members back to the cover paper, paragraphs 2.1 and 2.2, where this committee is being asked to seek assurance of the adequacy of a council's management response, and also as well to identify any issues which should be forwarded to other committees for consideration. So if you could bear those points in mind when Richard introduces the council's management response. So Richard, over to you, please.
Yes, thanks, Chair, and you've done the first part for me in describing the purpose of it. In terms of the management response, as Colin has outlined, this report is timely for us, given that we are now developing a new direction, a new community and corporate plan, and the subsequent then redevelopment then of the asset management plan and people strategy that will obviously align to deliver the council's priorities and also take account of the relevant evidence around asset management and workforce at the current time. So in setting out the response that's been agreed with the Deputy Chief Executive and Chief Officer of People and Governance, who are responsible for asset management and workforce respectively, the response there outlines that those points Colin has rightly raised. I know a lot of them are centred around the Sustainable Development Principle, which Colin's exactly right. We must apply as we develop both our corporate plan, our enabling strategies are set in the response. Those will be considered and embedded within it, and in terms of then scrutinising the development of that plan and also then the ongoing monitoring of the performance and evaluation of the delivery of it, that will be set out within the appropriate scrutiny arrangements, and in that discussion talk about with the role of the committee as well. So you'll have an opportunity to actually scrutinise that in action. And the only other point to add in terms of your role in reviewing progress against Audit Wales's recommendations and the Council's response to those, this action plan will be incorporated into our regular Audit Wales work programme progress report that you'll be able to track then. Are we progressing in line with the response we set out? And if not, what we are doing to either escalate those issues or the change in direction we're taking, if that would be appropriate. But that's your way of tracking as well, those specific recommendations, both in terms of as they're laid out in the management response and also the practical development, therefore, of the asset management plan and the people strategy as well.
Thank you, Richard. So, questions and comments to Richard, bearing in mind the paragraph 2.1 about is the response as outlined by Richard adequate in the context of the report as received? Ian, please.
I don't know, I'm not answering that question directly, but I suppose the completion date of July 2023 on all of these recommendations is a cause for questioning, I think.
A bit of the rationale behind that. The asset management and people strategy out some of our key enabling assets and obviously our workforce development that will follow some of the policy directions set by the new community and corporate plan, which is currently being developed, and then subsequent to the development of that and an appropriate consultation and engagement on it, the asset management plan and people strategy will then take its direction from that and be developed. So that's looking at end date when you have a complete plan. Of course, engagement and the thinking behind that will be developed between now and then, and in some cases, as Colin has mentioned, some of the data analysis and existing works already in place will be there to inform that. So that's why it's July 23, recognising that's when a final plan in place. But in between, there will obviously be other arrangements for how we manage our assets and our workforce still ongoing. So they won't be a void as such.
So I think I understand the completion date. I'd like to understand the interim milestones, and I'd like this committee to be well cited in terms of progress against those milestones. Yet again, I will speak to the officers, Peter Davis and Andy Woffin in particular, to take this work forward, because I do want this committee, bearing in mind the points you raised about people and several parts of this meeting as well as previous meetings, it's a critical element from a risk and control perspective that this committee has a legitimate interest over. So if maybe Wendy, if you could task myself with that action, and to come back to the committee's meeting in October with an update in terms of how we are going to, one, ensure this committee has visibility over these matters, and two, we track progress as we move through to developing a revised strategy in respect to people and asset management. I assume that's the committee satisfied with that, but are there any final questions or comments before we move on, please?
There was just one point, Chair. Do we know when we're expecting the finalisation of the new corporate plan? Because everything that you're planning depends on that being signed off, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I believe that's imminent. Peter would probably be better placed than me to provide that update, but I believe certainly initial consultation that would be due imminently. But that's something maybe we can come back to the committee and clarify.
Yeah, if we could come back to that. So thank you, Richard. That's a fair comment. Okay, we're on the home straight. So the next agenda item number 8, I believe, 9, I beg your pardon, is for strategic risk assessment. This paper will be yet again introduced by Richard Jones, Performance Manager, and I would draw yet again members' attention to the point in 2.1 and to an extent 2.2. So bearing those points in mind about for us considering the effectiveness of the authority's risk management arrangements and the extent to which strategic risks facing the authority are appropriately captured, Richard, over to you to talk us through the risk register and other elements.
Great. Thank you, Chair. So the aim of the report set out the strategic risks that Council have identified as the most relevant at the current time and how we're mitigating those risks. And the purpose is for members to use their support to analyse and continually review the effectiveness of both the Council's risk identification and management. I'm conscious this is the first time for some members of the committee we presented the risk management report, so just spend a little bit of time clarifying the purpose of the report for you as a committee, and also a little bit about our strategic risk management policy that's informed it, and then the updates we've made to the risk register before you today. So Governance and Audit Committee has a role to consider the effectiveness of the authority's risk management arrangements and the extent to which strategic risks facing the authority are appropriately captured. Reviewing the actual risk register, which is before you today, as an important part of this assurance. And the focus, particularly for you today, is to seek assurance on the extent to which the strategic risks facing the authority are appropriately captured within the register. The broader part of your role, we also provide other reports for you to help inform that. So to fulfil your role in considering the effectiveness of the authority's risk management arrangements overall, we also produce an annual appraisal of our performance management arrangements, which includes an appraisal of our risk management arrangements. And we also produce, as you've seen in the last couple of meetings, our self-assessment report that self-assesses a range of our strategic planning and risk management arrangements as part of it, along with a variety of other areas of the Council's work. So in discussion with the Chair going forward, we'll further develop this report to give you a greater assessment of the process that has been undertaken to produce a risk register, as well as the actual risk register itself, which is appended today. So a little bit more about the strategic risk register. This sets out whole authority strategic risks. It assures that those risks are identified and monitored by the Council, that measures are in place to control these risks are appropriate, and these risks are systematically reviewed by senior managers and elected members. And this is in line with the Council's strategic risk management policy, a summary of which is provided in Appendix 2 for you. The strategic risk assessment is continually updated throughout the year to reflect the changing nature of risks the Council is facing, and the risks identified are those strategic risks that typically affect the Council as a whole and which would pose a significant threat of the Council's ability to deliver its strategic goals or ambitions. The assessment only covers high and medium level strategic risks. Lower level strategic risks are not included unless they are expected to escalate within the 3 years covered by the report. And strategic risk management is only one part of the Council's risk arrangements. Risk is managed through a variety of arrangements within the Council, including things like our emergency management plans, health and safety arrangements, insurance arrangements, and teams service plans, to give example of a few. To move briefly then to the strategic risk register itself, which sets out the strategic risk, the responsibility holders for that risk, the risk levels, pre and post mitigation, the rationale as to why the risk has been identified, and then subsequent mitigating action and progress against those for each of the risks. There has been a number of updates in the last 6-9 months since the report was last before this committee. Numerous risks have been changed or updated, and those are set out within the cover report. Some risks that have been added include risks around the cost of living, risks around the suitability and affordability of housing in the area, and also some changes and amendments to risks reflecting, for example, rising pressures in children's and adult social care as well. And as well as sort of new risks and amendments to existing risks, some risks have also been de-escalated escalated from the strategic risk register, and those are set out in the table at the end of the report, and identifies why they've been removed, and also importantly, in removing them, where the remaining risk will continue to be managed or monitored, where it still exists and needs to be managed. As I've already said, the risk assessment is very much a living document. It's updated at regular intervals, reflecting the latest evidence of strategic risks to the council, and the live risk register, the risk register that's continually updated, is available on the council's intranet site for members to utilise at any point. That's in addition to us bringing it before you on a six monthly basis, as I described, and the report will also be scrutinised by Performance and Overview Scrutiny Committee in the next month or so, who have a particular role there in holding to account for the management and mitigating the risk by those by those responsibility holders identified. So I'm happy to take any questions, Chair. Just probably coming back to the recommendations, I think particular focus for you today around assessing the extent to which strategic risks facing the authority are appropriately captured within the strategic risk register, and we will present you further reports to inform your role about how effective risk management overall is within the organisation. But it's important in doing that you actually see the risk register in action, so to speak, as well, and not just the process that goes into producing it. And in answering questions, I'm conscious we will not have all the risk owners here. If there's any technical points, we can seek to get those answered after back to the committee after the meeting. So that's some context, and happy to take questions.
So thank you, Richard. Very, very helpful. So if I may start. Richard's alluded to the fact that I've met with Richard and other officers earlier this week to talk through the papers, and this paper was a core subject of those discussions. If I go back to recommendations, Richard is quite right. Following our discussion, we are not going to consider the effectiveness of the authority's risk management arrangements at this meeting, but that does require a separate paper. So what we're being asked currently is really, at this point, a sense check in terms of the content of a strategic risk register. Does it accord with our understanding of the key risks facing the organisation? I think that's the general ask. If I then look at the risk register itself, it contains lots of helpful information. The information for me is useful for the officers. It's more of a working document than a report for our purposes. And indeed, I thought a lot of information was superfluous to our sort of purposes. And I fed back to Richard and others in terms of my preferred format for reporting in future on this topic. For me, the key is an articulation of the strategic risks facing the organisation, what actions are being taken, and then what actions have been taken over the preceding period. So we have a line of sight in terms of those actions which are committed to, those actions which are completed, those actions which weren't completed, and why. So we can understand what progress is being made. And the current strategic risk register doesn't give that clear line of sight to us, in my estimation. Clearly, I'd welcome your thoughts in a few moments' time. Nonetheless, to repeat the points I've just made, it's a very helpful document, especially at this first time I've seen it. It gave lots of insight in terms of how risks are understood and are being managed, but it wasn't clear to me in terms of the precise actions being taken, who's accountable, and what outputs, what KPIs, key performance indicators, key risk indicators I'd be looking at to demonstrate progress over the period. I'm hoping that made some sense. I'll pause there and go to committee members for their questions and comments. And there's lots of questions and comments. Right, it's not popping up, and I need to get better at using this system. Okay, Phil, over to you first, please.
Well, you've just covered some of what I was going to say, Chair, so I shall be extremely brief. This has always been a living document, isn't it? And the status of risk just change. It will go from medium to high. I suppose the way my thought process was going was, we know we're going to be in severe financial constraints over the next period, and I was really looking for how we flag up things that are going wrong as they're going wrong, because we only tend to find out at budget setting time, and but I'm on the same track as you there.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So what I think Phil's talking to is our approach to what I would call horizon scanning. How do we, as a council authority, identify those risks, and how are they then sort of captured within the risk register process and then thereafter mitigated? And I do think that's the subject of a separate paper, in my estimation, and which should come back to this committee in due course. Move on to Ian, please.
Yeah, thanks. I had a couple of points, and one relates to that, I suppose, because in 3.5 you refer to the new risks, and you talk a little bit about financial risks and inflation. And I just wondered, when things are more rapidly moving, such as the energy price thing, looking at the risks across the council for that, I mean, thinking about the risks to demand on services because of residents facing that, the risks to businesses and employment as businesses may go under in the county, but then also risks to the council's own operations in terms of, you know, the energy bills in schools, in our offices, in our other operations. So to what extent is that sort of more rapidly changing environment being incorporated into that? So that was the first one. And I suppose it relates to the second one. No, it doesn't relate. It's separate to the second one. Looking at the 13 risk, I have to say that I'm looking forward to interrogating how we're managing the risks more at Performance and Overview Committee. But this one, just looking at the overview of the 13 risks that have been identified, I suppose I'm a little bit concerned that missing from that, and there may be more than one thing that's missing from that, but is risks to service delivery, other strategic risks that aren't there. I think this is where we need to be looking at. And one that immediately comes to mind, as you might expect from me, is about risks in relation to climate shocks. So we're talking about whether it's extreme heat waves, and you know, we may be weathered through this summer, although with some challenges for some residents. But I suppose more other ones are storms and flooding, which obviously we've experienced a lot of over the past couple of years. The fact there's no reference to climate shocks and particularly flooding in this, I don't know where within that initial background risk assessment that led us to get to that 13 it appeared and how it was assessed. But I'm surprised it's not there as a looking at both a short and a long-term risk to the council's operations and to its residents.
So to pick those up in turn, yeah, obviously the risk environment has been continued to be a dynamic process. The strategic risk management report and arrangements is one part of that. So services are responsible for their own risks and managing and mitigating those through the range of their arrangements they have in place. So some of those more live issues they will be managing on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, and assessing and adjusting their plans accordingly. Those will then be escalated, particularly for our service planning arrangements, which will then inform our strategic risk management plan. Where those risks are particularly fast-moving, they may go straight on strategic risk register just due to the nature of the speed. So I think that's probably something just to pick up in terms of this strategic risk register, that there will be a range of other ongoing day-to-day, week-to-week arrangements within service areas which will be managing those risks in more detail, and the strategic risk register identifies the headline issues and key mitigating actions we're taking at a strategic level, and hopefully through those mitigating actions it'll help you demonstrate some of the level of detail that's happening on a regular basis within service areas to manage them. So that's probably just the first one around the ongoing risk. It's a very good point about the nature of risk changing very rapidly at the moment. In terms of risk 13, and again, the good point made around climate shocks and more extreme weather and how we respond to that. That's actually covered under risk 11, where we've identified around, particularly as you say, the extreme weather we've seen through the summer, and that covers around the risk of our commitment to decarbonise our operations. But in terms of the mitigation actions, it's about how we deliver our climate emergency strategy, but also how we prepare and adapt to the impact of climate change as well, and the impact and the progress we're making against that is updated there. I think also that just highlights the point where there's lots of interrelationships with the nature of some of these risks as well. That for example, the financial risks we face that can impact on a range of different our service areas. It's identified as a financial risk, but recognising it could come across a number of our service areas. I think that's probably a good point to raise as well about the integration of the dependencies between these risks. We have to identify them in terms of their direct impact, but also in how they may impact on other services departments and other risks within the council as well. So hopefully that answers around risk 13 and its links to risk 11.
Yeah, if I may come back, Chair, on this, on both aspects of that. In terms of the climate shocks, I'm not sure that is covered in risk 11, because that's a risk of policy priority in terms of our decarbonisation agenda and our ability to do that within the constraints that we're facing. I think that's separate. What I'm talking about is climate shocks that are actually a risk to service delivery. So I do think it's significantly different. It's not about our attempts to decarbonise, but although it does relate to our adaptation strategy, which does still come part of our climate emergency planning. So I think it is a separate risk, and I think it would be unhelpful to conflate the two, because I think they are significantly different. And that's why I was wondering whether it's not I'm saying that risk number 13, but of the 13 risks, I think there should be a 14th risk, which is the climate shocks. Back to the first point, though, about just using the energy price rises as a particular example. I understand what you're saying in terms of service departments identify their own risks and do that. I suppose I'm less sure on something like that where it is clear from a senior level of an overview that this is a shock, an economic shock that is going to affect all aspects of the council's operations, whether it's sufficient to wait for that to float up from the service departments, or whether actually the senior leadership should be identifying this straight away as an all-encompassing risk to all aspects of the council's operations, and should be coming up with both initially a risk assessment and reporting on that risk assessment for that, and then coming up with an action plan or a mitigation plan to deal with it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I accept the points around risk 11, that the headline risk, as you say, is about our policy commitment there around decarbonisation. The two parts in the risk identified talk about that risk and also the risk around resilience to those climate shocks, and they're within the same risk, but they are different. So I accept that point. And sorry, I didn't explain that first of all. And I think it's similar with your last point as well. Say those ongoing risks, but there are clearly arrangements in place to escalate straight to a strategic level where things are happening quickly and need to be dealt with at a more strategic level straight away, and that we don't necessarily wait for those to filter through. The cost of living is one example where our senior leadership team will be putting in work around that and have been putting in work around that. Similarly, some of the risks we would have seen, for example, through the COVID-19 pandemic, we would have set up emergency management responses to that straight away at the strategic level to respond. So those sorts of risks that do come in at strategic level are fast evolving, will be identified at appropriate senior level through the risk management measures we have in place. Some say it will be, and even then, obviously, some of those will affect service areas in different ways, and they will have their own arrangements as well as the more strategic arrangements to respond to them.
If I may just come in there, and Ian's made some excellent points as usual. So I suppose I know we're not going to be necessarily talking about this directly, or that was not the intention anyway, but how is this risk register initially populated? Because my thought was, going back to Ian's point, is that you've got great deal of expertise in this room and across the council, the councillors, especially those who are long-standing, who have significant insights into the risks faced by the authority, council taxpayers, etc., etc. So how do you capture that, Richard? And is there opportunity to capture it more effectively, so you can actually bring it more directly into risk register, rather than relying on committees such as this one, who are doing more of a sense check? Have you any thoughts, please?
Yeah, so the risk register is a construct of a range of different information and evidence, both in terms of the formal structures we have in place and the range of evidence that flows through from different reports at different times. So for example, the main basis of it, we have our service plans in place. They identify strategic risks and operational risks in service areas. They're updated on a regular basis, and we review at a desktop exercise the evidence from those and what they're saying currently about what are the main risks to the organisation. Outside of that, then, we also have other information and evidence, such as reports from our auditors or external regulators and inspectors, as well as we've just discussed, other information that will be coming in about relative and pertinent risks either to the county or the country or other issues as well. So they're all factored into then us doing a desktop exercise that identifies all that evidence, assessing that against our current existing risk register, identifying if anything has changed or moved or is new that needs to be considered. We then produce a report for our senior leadership team who review that evidence and also add in their expertise from their networks and their teams as well around where some of the strategic risks facing the organisation are positioned at the moment, and then the risk register is reviewed and updated accordingly, including working with those responsibility holders and the directorate management team. So it's a continuing cycle. There's a pyramid in place to capture that, but recognising that risk environment is uncertain and changes over time. We also obviously have got horizon scanning in place to pick up various parts of the evidence as it needs to be updated, and that's where also those updates happen on a regular basis. So it's a combination of existing process and obviously bringing in a range of existing evidence as it's identified.
Okay, helpful. I think I want to come back to that point in due course, but maybe move on to Tony, please.
Hello, thank you again, Chair. You touched on risk 13 briefly, but what I find is you've got the optimism that by 2025 it'll be a medium risk, whereas at the moment I believe it's a very high risk. Can you explain your optimism on getting that to be a medium risk in 3 years' time, where housing problems are not going to go away very quickly?
Yeah, and recognising that some of these are longer-term strategic challenges to the organisation. So the risk has been assessed to decrease based on the progress and impact of the mitigating actions. So in terms of the work being undertaken to address homelessness in the county, delivery of the housing support programme partnership, delivery of the local development plan. But I think it's a good challenge to recognise that some of those things, even though we may take the mitigating action progress, that they may take longer to actually have the impact to lower the risk around that. So I think that's a good challenge to
Before we had the Ukrainian crisis, this was always a high risk in any case. You've built in the Ukrainian situation, which may change after the 6 months, where the policy might change a little bit. So I think this is a very high risk, not a high risk, and in the future it will probably in the next 3 years be a fairly high risk. Would my premise be correct, do you believe?
I think what you've identified is that the risk level needs to be reviewed in light of the ongoing evidence and progress of those mitigating actions, and then reviewed accordingly as we would do with all the risks. So I think so that's a good point on that risk. We'll take back to the risk owner to consider.
Thank you. Martin?
Thanks, Richard. It's been a really helpful discussion. I think I share a lot of what the Chair said at the beginning of the meeting, and I guess my probably frustration with this paper was simply that there looked like there was an awful lot of work being done for very little gain. There's a number of risks which set off as a unmitigated high risk, and 3 years on after all the mitigation, it's still a high risk. So I kind of wonder why we're turning up for work, because we're not changing anything. So I think there's something in there, I think. And I'm also very nervous when I see ongoing written a lot. I mean, again, coming back to the chair's point on the last paper, understanding what we can measure progress. If something's going to happen, we need to know when and if it's making a difference or not. And ongoing is kind of feels like a bit of a cop-out. I understand some of these things aren't moments in time; they are processes. But somewhere in the 3 years, that process needs to come to be crystallised, I guess. Just generally, I would say it was helpful to have the table in the narrative paper which talks about things going up, things going down, new things and things disappearing. I couldn't see that because they're not numbered. They don't tie into the risks, the 13 risks that are in there below. And it would be nice to see like a little flag along each one that says new or deleted, and like we grey them out well and lose them off there so we keep track of them. And just to sort of understanding how and again, direction of travel, as the chair talked about earlier, so we understand those things. And I think what you said in answer to questions was there is a bottom-up process. So there's lots of risks being managed somewhere, and there's an escalation process. And I guess the senior executive board does that sort of filtering through. This one's important enough, and this one's important enough to come up, as well as adding their own, I guess, because the problem is if everyone at the bottom looks at their little bit, perhaps they don't pull together enough to become a cost of living crisis risk, which might be something that comes from the top. Is that a fair reflection of the process?
Yeah, that's the purpose of having the strategic risk register, is taking the range of evidence, looking at what that means strategically for the council, and how then we subsequently identify and manage that risk as well. And just in terms of a couple of broader points, I think, in terms of being clearer on new risks, change risks, I think comes back to the points the chair's raised as well. And in terms of those, the risk levels and how they changed over the 3 years, reflecting that the strategic risk register covers strategic risks, and some of those are complex in nature, similar to we were just talking about around risk 13, for example. There's a range of issues at play there. The council, through its mitigating action, can have an impact on those. It's then how that impact can be materialised in terms of lowering that risk level within the 3 years, or whether that may take longer, and also recognising there's other external risk factors that could come into play that impact on that as well, that maybe not directly within the council's control to mitigate. But obviously, where possible, we should be looking to say, are our mitigating actions strong enough to actually address that risk within the elements of the risk we can impact on through the role we undertake as a council, and that's also partly why the risk levels are continually reviewed as well, to reflect that things can change, which may be directly or not indirectly within the council's control, that could have an impact on that risk. But hopefully, the longer term direction of travel through the risk management process we have in place, and the strategic risk, identifying the strategic risks, would be to look to mitigate them down over time. That in some cases that may be longer than the 3 years currently covered by the risk register.
Thank you, Richard. Phil?
Rich, has everybody got access to the hub? I know all the members have, but how about you have? Because the service business plans, I don't know if you've ever looked at them. No, well, if you go into finance and performance management on the hub and then click on the service business plans, there's colour-coded progress and also narrative on all the various things that they're doing and how they're progressing with it. So that would be a very good source of monitoring as we go, and they're all updated quarterly. So it's something worth having a look at.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I want to wrap up in a few moments, but just check, are there any final questions or comments? Okay, So a really helpful discussion. I think we covered a number of topics. I think we're in a position to note the paper for risk register. I think you've heard, Richard, some challenges in terms of the content of the risk register, especially in relation to the absence of, for example, climate shock type risks. Maybe the cost of living, the risks and issues associated with that are not particularly well captured. We've also talked about the fact that a lot of these risks are interconnected and indeed are really dynamic. Yeah, and of course, the authority, as well as all public authorities, is entering a period of huge uncertainty from a whole host of dimensions. And I don't think the risk register is currently constructed really adequately reflects the risks and significance of those risks facing the authority, nor am I clear over the actions being taken and the priority of those actions, noting that the number of those actions will be common across risks. And the other point as well is the horizon scanning piece. I know you've talked about, Richard. I come back to my point about my suggestion that there is a top-down process by which councillors and officers actually participate, possibly in a workshop or some kind of similar type structure, whereby you get those high levels of views up front to allow you to better articulate the risks facing the authority. Just an idea, but it's something I think that you and others could consider. So directionally, I think risk register is about right, noting the points and challenges over the detailed content. I do think there's further work to do to assure this committee in terms of the overall risk management arrangements and their effectiveness. But saying all of that, I think we're in a position to receive and note your paper. That's my attempt at summarising discussions, but please, are there any corrections to what I've said? No? Okay. Thank you. In that case, we'll move on. I just need to find my place, so bear with me. I think the next item is the forward work programme. I should explain my laptop is being awfully slow, so once it actually wakes up and gets there, you're right. So the forward work programme, it's there for information. Clearly, if you have any points to raise in terms of items which are missing, please speak now. Otherwise, we will move on.
Just, Chair, that point about the being honest and frank about what things can arrive at what meetings. So Andy's absolutely right in putting his Q2 report into the November meeting, which is right. Audit Wales has its end of September review scheduled to come to the 13th of October. So I admire their ambition. I'm not sure about their realism. So just those kind of things about scheduling is really important on this.
Okay, Andy, please.
Thanks, Chair. Just on for your October meeting, fifth item down should read invitation of officers and heads of service, not section 151 officer, regarding limited options, limited opinions. And for November's meeting, picking up Martin's point, my Q2 progress will be on 22-23, not 21-22. That'll be very untimely of me. Thanks, Chair.
Sorry, just picking up on Andrew's theme. The November meeting, the Treasury Outturn report will be a 6th monthly update to the committee on 22-23 Treasury performance.
Thank you. No other comments? Great, let's move on. And we're now on to the minutes. So firstly, thank you, Wendy, for minutes. Excellent as always. We will turn the pages. I'm on page of meeting pack 215. We will take matters of accuracy and matters arising. And Martin's raising his hand. Martin?
Page 1, right at the top. The list of present is a little bit confusing because under county councillors we've all been elevated, Chair, Colin and myself, and we've all repeated in those lay members, so they just need to be deleted out of councillors.
Yeah, apologies about that. It's part of our system that just does that every time you refresh the page. So I will be careful.
Good spot, thank you. I certainly didn't see that. Thank you.
Chair, will we have the fourth lay member next time?
Good question. Andy Woffin, would like to give an update in terms of where we are with the recruitment process, please?
The answer is probably no.
Okay.
Short answer, I'm in process of going through the recruitment process. I need to get on track with that, get the panel back together, sort out the advert, which I'm hoping to do in the next 2 weeks.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to page 2. Right. Pausing a moment because I did have some notes and I can't quite see them. Nope. Okay, page 2 is okay from my perspective. Page 3, so that's page 217 in your meeting pack. Okay, here we go. Page 4, so that's page 218. Just a note on the second paragraph, starting, the Deputy Chief Exec commented that, etc., etc. Clearly, we did not receive that paper today, but I understand it's going to be tabled at our October meeting. Moving on to the next page in a minute, that's page 219 in the meeting pack. Page 220. Page 221, and 222 is blank. Okay, so no matters of accuracy, no matters arising, as far as I can see. So could we have something to propose minutes, please?
Happy to move, Chair.
Thanks, Phil. And 2 seconds, Martin. Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you. That draws to the end the meeting. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. The next meeting is in October, and I did write down the date, but I can't see it. Thank you ever so much. Look forward to seeing you all then.